Okay, this might seem like a training video, but it's actually a lecture video because this doesn't lead to an assignment. We're just going to do this page together. And you're going to get more experience with sharps and flats and understanding the layout of the keyboard. So this is in the ivory or light yellow section. It's called whole steps and half steps. It's after the write the notes E, G, B, D, F, and sometimes middle C that you guys just did. So the point of this is to get some practice writing sharps and flats and understanding how they adjust the keyboard, positioning of notes, and it will be a primer to get us into scales later as well. It'll also help us think about the layout of the actual keyboard right here. So it says, find these notes on the keyboard, label in between the notes whether the distance between the notes is a half step, which is one piano key, or a whole step. And it gives an example. So you could do this with me. That's a C and a D right there. And that's like a C and a D right there. And see how I've said this is a 1, meaning a whole step, which is 2 piano keys right there, because down here you can see that you have to go 1, 2 piano keys. 1 piano keys is a half step, 2 piano keys is a whole step, so we're going 1 for a whole step. Whereas up at the top right here, where it says B and C right there, come back to my keyboard here. Here's a B, there's a C. There's no going up to a black key there. It's just going straight across. It's a single half step. And so I have labeled that with a half right there, okay? So this is C, D, E, F, G, A, B. You don't actually have to write those in. That's just for reference in the video. But let's take a look at our keyboard right here. So we're going to start on C over here. I'm going to write these notes in right there. There's my C, my D, my E, my F, my G, my A, B, and then C. So that matches the notes on the first line of that worksheet. And it's saying, let's look at the distance between these notes. So we already know that to get from C to D, that's a whole step because it's 2 half steps, right? It's a whole step. And from D to E, 1 half step, 2 half steps, 2 keys, that's a 1. But between E and F, there's only a single key because there's no black key right there. So that's a half step right there. Now, you can go through and calculate these all like that, or we can do what I like to think about, which is everything's a whole step because everything has a black key between the notes, except for E to F is a half step and B to C is a half step. But every other place has a black key between it, so it'll be 2 half steps, right? 2 half steps, 2 half steps, 2 half steps. Only between E and F and B and C are there half steps. So let's go back over here and let's mark this in. So between D and E is a whole step, 1 for whole, right? And between E and F, it's that place on the keyboard where there's only a half step. So we're going to write a half step right there, right? Between there and there. And the only other half step is up there. Everything else is a whole step, right? Like that and like that. They're all a whole step, okay? So what we're going to do now, it says find these notes, different starting note, different ending note, and look at the distances between them. And then if they're different from here, the spacing on the first line, then we have to add a sharp to a note or notes to make the distance the same. So let's remember that the only place that there's a half step to begin with is between E and F and B and C. So let's quickly go in here to say, where's our E to F and B to C? Here's our B and C, so that's a half step right there, right, between these 2 notes. And between E and F right there is a half step. Everywhere else is a whole step, right? Because there's a black key on the keyboard between them. Let's check it out and see how it compares against these notes right there. So this was a whole step, that's good. They're both whole steps. From here to here was a whole step, that's good. Okay, from here to here is a half step, that matches up. From here to here is a whole step, that matches up. From here to here is also a whole step. We're just comparing parallel places in the line, right? But between here and here, this was a whole step, this is a half step. It's not big enough, right? The distance between these notes is bigger here than it is there. So to make this bigger, I've got my lower note and I've got my upper note, and on the top line it's this far apart, and on the bottom line here it's only that far apart. What I want to do is I want to raise this note up so that there's more space there. So I do that by adding a sharp. And if you remember, sharps are, they look like pound signs, like that. And you write them about the same size as the note, just to the left of the note on the same line or space in notation. So since this is my F right here on the line, I'll put a sharp right there. When I do that, the distance between here and here, let me show you back here. We're on an E and an F, but if I go to F sharp, it goes to right there. It gets bigger, right? F, F sharp, half step, whole step. So that will now change from that to here. Now that will be a whole step. Conversely, we wanted a half step here, and this was a whole step because F to G is a whole step, but when you go to F sharp, it squishes that down, the distance gets smaller, and so by making that F sharp, that also makes that a half step right there, which is what we wanted. So to make this set of notes have the same distance between note number 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and then 1 again, because it's the same note, we had to put a sharp on the F sharp. This pattern of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step is something that we call a major scale. You're probably familiar with the sound of it. It's in all the music we're using, and there we go. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, major scale. If we did this here without the sharp, it would sound very similar, although higher, because we're starting on a higher note, but the last 2, 3 notes would sound wrong. That's different, right, with the F natural. So raise that to F sharp, right? This is called a C major scale because it goes from C to C, and it has this pattern of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. This is called a G major scale now because it goes from G to G, and it has that same pattern, although we had to add a sharp to make that pattern happen. All right, here we go. Let's do number 3. So remember that it's between E and F and B and C that are the half steps. Everything else is a whole step. Currently, there's my E and F right there, and there's my B and C right there, right? And so that means that's a whole step and a whole step and a whole step and a whole step and a whole step, right? Let's compare again with the top line. That's good. This is no good. We wanted this to be a whole step right here to make the major scale pattern. It's only a half step, but we're going to do the same trick we did with this E and F. We want to make this further up higher. So we're going to take this E and F, which is a half step right here, and make it F sharp. Push it up to there, which will make the distance bigger. 1, 2, right? 2 half steps is a whole step. So we come in here and put that F sharp right there, like that. Now, that opens this up and makes it a whole step. But at the same time, it pushes up against this note right here. Remember, F sharp goes to G much closer. And so this becomes a half step now, which luckily, that's what we want. We want a half step here. And now by pushing this up, we fix this problem and get that one a half step as well. Let's keep going. Whole step, right? Whole step from there to there. Whole step from there to there. Have the same problem we did up here. We want a whole step. We have a half step between B and C. So let's raise the C up to make this bigger. C sharp right there. This now will open up from a half step, 1 piano key, to 2 piano keys. Look here. Here's my B to C. If I make it C sharp, it raises up 1 key. Now it's 1, 2 half steps, or a whole step right there. So by putting the sharp there, again, pound sign, same line just before, or space just before the note on the left-hand side. That's a 1. It encroaches in here. The C goes like this. So now I only have a half step there, and it makes that work. This has the same pattern of whole and half steps as these guys now. It will sound like a major scale, but it starts on D, so we'd call this the D major scale. If we didn't put those sharps in, it would sound interesting, but it wouldn't sound like a major scale. It's a good scale. It's called D Dorian, which is a minor mode. We'll talk about that some other time, but we want to learn how to use these sharps and flats to make this pattern, and this will get us ready for scales a little bit later. All right, I'm going to do this here. Remember that to pre-scan this, the only place currently with no sharps and flats that there are half steps is between B and C, right there, and between E and F, right there, okay? Everywhere else is a whole step, currently with no sharps or flats, okay? So let's look again. We wanted a whole step, and then we wanted another whole step, but this is a half step. It's contracted together, so let's put a sharp before the C, which will open this up, making the space bigger to a whole step. It simultaneously makes the distance from this note to that note smaller, so now that's a half step. But that's what we wanted. We wanted a half step here, like this. Then we want a whole step. We have that. And then we want another whole step, but we only have a half step right here, right? So we will take this second note and raise it higher by putting a sharp there, okay? That makes this guy become a whole step, simultaneously encroaching right there and making that be a half step, okay? Let me just show you that on here again. If I have my E to F right here, and I make it F sharp, it goes to there, which gives me my whole step, but now F sharp and G are a half step apart, right? Okay, so here I want another whole step, but because I put that sharp there, I have a half step. How do I fix it? I just keep pushing notes up, right? So if this is a half step from F sharp to G, and I need a whole step, I can't go backwards and do anything here because it would ruin what I fixed already, but I can push this note up, so I'm going to put a G sharp, okay? Let me show you what that looks like on our piano keyboard. All right, so originally I had an F and a G, yes? I'm not right-handed, I gotta change hands here. Originally I had an F and a G right there, and you can see that they're 2 keys apart, so that's a whole step. Then I changed this to be F sharp right there. Now I'm a half step apart. If I give this a sharp and move to this one right here, like that, now I still am a whole step, 1, 2 apart like that. And then I need a half step to my A, and I've coincidentally made that right there. So you can keep pushing sharps and flats and things like that. Accidentals are what we call these symbols. That gives me a whole step between these guys now, which is what I wanted. And it squishes this guy up against there, which gives me a half step, which is what I want. And that's how we do this. Now, this has the same pattern of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, but it starts on A. Now listen to it without the sharps. It's an interesting sound. It's what we call a minor scale. We'll talk about that later. But what we want is the major scale. So A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. We'd call that the A major scale. You don't have to memorize all these things right now, but it would be nice if you remember the pattern is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. It's got 2 whole steps and a half step, 3 whole steps and a half step. All right, number 5, 6, and 7 does the same thing here, but we're going to use flats now instead, okay? So we still want to have this whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. But we want to go from F to F. So remember, half steps are currently between B and C because there's no sharps or flats, and E and F. Everything else is a whole step. All right. So let's take a look at this. Whole step, good. Whole step, good. We wanted a half step, but we have a whole step. Well, we can't go back and sharp this note and scrunch it in because then that makes this go further away from this note. So it's 1.5 steps. So we're going to take this top note here and pull it down. And remember, the way we do that is with a symbol that looks like a stylized B, like that. It's called a flat. It lowers it by 1 piano key. So the way we do this is we take this note here, we put a flat in front of it. Please go ahead and do this with me so you have the kinesthetic sort of memory of this as well. And then that crushes it inwards, and you get a half step here. This pulls a half step away from this note, so your half step here turns into a whole step. Let me show you that on the keyboard, okay? So I'm here on my A, and I'm going to a B right here. And you can see that that's 1 half step, 2 half steps. That's a whole step right there. And then I have a C right there. What we wanted to do is we want to lower this note to pull it back here, so that will become contracted in and become a half step. So B will go to there and become B flat, right? Now I've got a half step there because it's just 1 piano key. And since this pulled down away from there, now I have 1, 2, a whole step right there. So this becomes from there to there, a half step. And from here to here, a whole step, like that. Okay? All right. Let's keep marching through. I know this is kind of getting long, but the repetition is important. The advantage of video, of course, is you can stop and take a break, get a drink, something like that, and come back, right? Whole step is what we want, whole step is what we want, whole step what we want, half step there. It's perfect already. We just needed to add 1 flat. Listen to it without the flat. This note right there is kind of wrong. It's another, what we call a Lydian mode, which is a major mode that is used in jazz and also lots of moving music. With the flat, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, right there. Okay. This scale starts on B flat. So it's changed already. See, B flat there and C right there, like that. And then D, and then E, and so on. So the distance between B flat to C, not B to C, is already a whole step, and then a whole step, and then a whole step, and then half step between the E to F, and half step, actually I think that's it. Whole step, whole step, whole step, like that, all the way up. So let's check this out. Whole step, whole step. We need a half step right here. This is too big, so we're gonna pull this note backwards, right? By lowering the note with a flat. Put it on the same line, just in front of the note. This whole step gets contracted in, becomes a half step. This half step gets opened up, becomes a whole step. Drop the pencil. Disaster. Okay, sorry. So that becomes a whole step right there. And then this is a whole step we want. That's a whole step we want. This is a half step we need, but we currently have a whole step. So we take this note and we bring it down with a flat. And that kind of makes sense because if we're going to start on B flat, probably want to end on the same note. Otherwise, here's without that. Oops, wrong note. So we dial this back in and it becomes contracted into a half step. This is called the B flat scale. 2 flats, B flat. All right, I'm gonna just cruise through this one without referring back to the keyboard. You can rewind this as you need to. we're going to start on E flat and go up. And remember, the half steps were between B and C and E and F. There's my B and C, so there's a half step right there. This E and F would have been a half step, but this E flat has pulled it down, so it's already a whole step. So all these other ones are not B to C or E to F. So this looks fine. Whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step. We need a half step here. We got to pull this note down. We'll put a flat right there. Okay? And then this was a whole step, but because we took the key below and moved it out, it became 1.5 steps. That's too big, right? 1.5 steps. So let's pull this note down as well, right? Whole step, flat this note. That's like 1.5 steps. So we're going to bring that note back, right? Again, here's my A, here's my B. Make that A flat. Now it's too big, so we bring this down as well, B flat, right there. And this will become a whole step as a result of that. This will be a whole step right there as well. This became a half step. And now we just keep going. Whole step, whole step. This is supposed to be a half step, but it's a whole step right now. We take this note here and we bring it down. All right? And that's how we do that. Now, this is an interesting exercise. In about a week, we'll start working in earnest on our scales. But it's good to know that a major scale has a pattern between the notes of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And it's good to be able to do this manually like this, but we'll use our flashcards and some memory devices to help us memorize these without having to measure every note to note. Anyhow, from this, you should get that a sharp raises a note or a key, and a flat lowers it, and you can alter the distance between notes to make whole steps and half steps by adding sharps or flats.